Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, as always, pretty simple. We take a whole stack of sources, articles, historical data, research, and we just pull out the most important bits of knowledge to give you that shortcut to being truly informed. And today we are opening up one of the most consequential and I would argue one of the most misunderstood documents in all of modern history, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points.
It really is. It's one of those things that, you learn about in school. It's taught as this high point of American idealism, this perfect blueprint for global peace, all built on fairness and democracy.
The noble failure.
Exactly. But when you move past that, that one paragraph summary in the textbook and you start digging into the sources, you look at the real political fights, the intense skepticism he faced at home and abroad, and then the just wildly contradictory results of trying to apply it. You realize the story is... it's just so much more complex.
Absolutely, and that's our mission today. We are going to really examine that gap, that huge, volatile chasm that opened up between the Wilsonian ideal, this promise of a totally new world order, and the brutal political reality of 1919. We're going to look at how these points were created, why they were met with so much hostility, and how their deeply conflicted implementation across Europe, the Near East, and Asia actually ended up laying the groundwork for future conflicts.
And to really get the weight of these points, you have to start at the beginning. Wilson gives this huge speech to Congress on January 8th, 1918. So the question is why? Why was America, a country that had only been in the Great War for 9 months, suddenly trying to define the peace terms for the entire world?
Okay, let's unpack that because, like you said, the timing is everything here. The U.S. gets into the war on April 6, 1917, and it was really pushed in by two big things, right? Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare.
Which was killing American civilians.
Right. And then the bombshell revelation of the Zimmerman telegram. So Wilson was, he was desperate to frame America's involvement as something more than just another messy European power struggle. He saw that as morally compromised. He wanted a crusade.
He needed a moral objective, something that went beyond the old nationalistic fights that had been tearing up the continent for centuries. But the need to grab that moral high ground, it became critically urgent just weeks before his speech, and that was all thanks to what was happening on the Eastern Front.
You're talking about the Bolshevik Revolution.
Exactly. After the Russian government collapses, the new Bolshevik regime, led by Vladimir Lenin, makes this devastatingly clever ideological move. In November 1917, he issues his decree on peace.
Okay.
And this document, it calls for a just and democratic peace immediately with no annexations, no indemnities. And this is the crucial part. He starts repudiating all the old foreign policy of Imperial Russia.
And what the Bolsheviks did next was just profoundly damaging to the Allied cause, wasn't it?
It was strategically brilliant, just utterly crippling for the Allies. The Bolsheviks published the secret treaties, all the secret deals that the old Tsarist regime had signed with Britain, France, and Italy.
So things like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, carving up the Middle East.
Sykes-Picot, the Treaty of London that promised Italy all this territory, it was all laid bare. It detailed exactly how the Allied powers planned to divide up the spoils of victory, allocating territories in Europe, Africa, the Near East, all into their specific spheres of influence.
So Lenin basically just published the receipts. He exposed the Allies as a bunch of greedy imperialists at the exact moment they were trying to claim they were fighting for democracy.
Precisely. The treaties made the Allied leaders look completely self-interested. It just validated the Bolshevik claim that the entire war was nothing more than a clash of imperialists. Wilson was terrified that communist revolutions would start spreading, especially if the Allies kept looking like the bad guys.
So the 14-point speech was an ideological weapon.
It was explicitly designed to counter Lenin's challenge. It offered a comprehensive, liberal alternatives to the world. Not peace through revolution, but peace through open agreements, free trade, and self-determination.
What's so fascinating, though, is that the points weren't just, rhetorical fluff. They were based on some really comprehensive, systematic study.
Oh, absolutely. They were the product of a group Wilson set up in 1917 called the Inquiry. It was basically a proto-think tank, a huge team, about 150 academic advisors. You had geographers, historians, political scientists, economists, all tasked with studying global conditions to formulate a practical American peace agenda.
So this wasn't just a list of moral hopes?
Not at all. The team, led by Wilson's close advisor, Colonel Edward House, produced nearly 2,000 separate reports. They were preparing for the peace conference. It was a highly specific, strategic diplomatic weapon.
tailored to steal the moral thunder back from Lenin.
That's the core of it. Walter Lippmann, one of the key drafters, he specifically wrote the territorial points as a direct rebuttal to those secret treaties that had just been exposed. And Colonel House, he summed up their task perfectly. He said it was to take the secret treaties, analyze the parts which were tolerable, and then develop a position which conceded as much to the Allies as it could, but took away the poison.
Wow. So that makes the 14 points less about naive idealism and much more about incredibly shrewd political strategy, using moral principles to actually undermine the power structures of your own allies.
That's it, exactly.
So when we look at the content, it's pretty clear Wilson was trying to translate his domestic progressive era ideas, things like accountability, open government, economic fairness, and just transplant them directly onto the world stage. He was demanding a complete overhaul of international affairs.
It was truly revolutionary for its time. And we can kind of group the 14 demands into 3 logical buckets to really understand the scope of his vision. So the first category, that's points I through V. These set out the general principles of transparency and a global economy. These were the big foundational rules that Wilson believed would just get rid of the structural causes of the war itself.
And point UN is the iconic one. Open diplomacy. Open covenants of peace, openly arrived at. That's the direct attack on the secrecy the Bolsheviks had just weaponized.
Indeed. It was meant to make all future alliances and treaties transparent, to get rid of those hidden obligations that had just dragged Europe into this catastrophe. Then you have point 2, which was maybe the most controversial one for one of our key allies.
Yeah.
Absolute freedom of the seas.
For Britain, yeah.
In peace and in war. Now, this was aimed at the German U-boat policy, sure, but it was also a direct challenge to Great Britain's historical dominance of the oceans and its use of the naval blockade as a weapon.
And then he moves on to economic prescriptions.
Point 3 called for free trade. The removal of economic barriers, equality of trade conditions. This was Wilson's vision for an open global commercial system where, American goods and influence could flow freely. Point 4 then gets at the arms race. Disarmament. Reducing armaments down to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety.
Just enough for defense, basically.
The idea was to stop that costly military buildup that creates an atmosphere where conflict just feels inevitable.
And then point V, this is the one that addresses the massive issue of global empires. And it was especially tricky in how it was worded. The colonial claims adjustment.
Very tricky. This point required an absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. And crucially, it said that in figuring out who gets what, the interests of the native populations must have equal weight with the claims of the colonial government.
Equal weight. That's the key phrase.
It is. But it's also incredibly ambiguous. It doesn't demand independence. It doesn't say that native interests should outweigh the colonial power's claims. It left a huge amount of room for interpretation, or, as we'll see, for manipulation.
Okay, so that's the first bucket. What's the second?
The second, and it's the largest category, covers points 6 through 13. These are all about territorial adjustments and the principle of self-determination. These points laid out the specific demands for redrawing the map after the collapse of the empires that started the war.
So this is where the rubber really meets the road, where Wilson starts demanding specific changes to the map.
Right. Point 6 deals with the very messy situation in Russia. It calls for the evacuation of Russian territory, securing its free development, and offering assistance. This was an explicit test of Allied goodwill toward the new, albeit unstable, Russian state.
And some of the others were more straightforward.
A few, yeah. Point 7 demanded the full evacuation and restoration of Belgian sovereignty. That's a pretty clear-cut case of just reversing a wartime invasion. Point 8 focused on France, restoration of its occupied territory, and, critically, righting the 1871 wrong of Alsace-Lorraine.
The territory Germany took after the Franco-Prussian War.
Exactly. Then we move south to the dissolving empires. Point IX mandated the readjustment of Italian frontiers along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. As we'll get into, this created a direct ideological clash with the secret promises Italy had already been given.
And point X was aimed at Austria-Hungary.
At the peoples of Austria-Hungary, promising them the freest opportunity to autonomous development. Now, notice the subtle wording there. Not independence, but autonomy.
But by the time they all got to Paris, the empire had already collapsed anyway, right?
It had completely dissolved, which made the point kind of irrelevant, but it did help solidify this principle of national self-determination. Then point XI handles the geopolitical cauldron that is the Balkans.
Of course.
It required the evacuation and restoration of Romania, Serbia, Montenegro. It secured guaranteed sea access for Serbia, And it provided international guarantees for the political and economic independence of all the Balkan states. The goal was to just stamp out the local fights that sparked the whole war in 1914.
And then the massive challenge of the Ottoman Empire under Point 12.
This one was incredibly delicate. It assured secure sovereignty for the Turkish portion of the empire, but it also demanded undoubted security of life and autonomous development for the other nationalities under Ottoman rule. And it stipulated that the Dardanelles should be permanently open to all nations.
That specific phrase, undoubted security of life, that's a really sobering reminder of the context here.
Well, it was a very calculated political choice of words. This was Wilson's implicit but undeniable response to fierce criticism back home in America. People like former President Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge had been just relentlessly attacking Wilson for his failure to act on the Armenian genocide.
Which had been raging since 1915.
Right. And Wilson, he was intent on this Germany first strategy, so he included this sort of minimum standard of protection for minorities to rebut the charge that his administration was just indifferent to the ongoing atrocities. It was a diplomatic attempt to mandate basic human rights.
Which then sets the stage for the creation of a massive new state in Eastern Europe with Point 13.
Point 13 was the creation of an independent Polish state, and it had to include populations that were indisputably Polish. But, crucially, it demanded that Poland must be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and its political and economic integrity had to be guaranteed by international covenant.
That access to the sea clause, that's going to become a huge problem.
It becomes one of those contentious issues at Versailles. It leads directly to the creation of the famous, or I should say infamous, Polish corridor.
And finally, that brings us to the third category.
Category 3, the cornerstone of future peace, which is just 1 point. Point 40.
The League of Nations.
Yes. Point 40 called for a general association of nations. It would be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Wilson saw this as the ultimate backstop, the enforcement mechanism to ensure that all the other 13 points could be upheld and that future disagreements would be solved by dialogue, not by another world war. This was the centerpiece. This was the thing he was willing to sacrifice almost everything else to get.
So the moment these points hit the world stage, they have these two completely different effects. On one hand, they're immediately translated, dropped as leaflets behind German lines, a powerful propaganda tool promising a just peace. But inside the Allied halls of power, the reaction was, well, it was icy.
The skepticism was intense. I mean, look at Britain first. Prime Minister David Lloyd George had just given a similar speech a few days earlier outlining British war aims, but Wilson's statement was just so much bolder it completely overshadowed his.
So he had to accept them for the sake of unity.
He had to, yeah. He accepted most of the points by November 1918. But he drew an absolute red line at point 2, freedom of the seas.
That's understandable. For the British Empire, naval supremacy was the foundation of their entire world. Accepting that would be like dismantling their whole defense strategy.
Exactly. They refused to give up the right to blockade an enemy in wartime. And they also insisted that the points had to be amended to explicitly include a demand for reparations from the Central Powers, to make sure the economic burden of the war fell on Germany.
And the French response was just pure cynicism.
Oh, Georges Clemenceau, the French leader, he was a hardened political realist. He was focused on one thing and one thing only: French security. His famous sarcastic remark, "The good Lord had only 10," it just perfectly sums up how these traditional European leaders saw Wilsonian idealism. It was naive. It was dangerous.
For Clemenceau, the war was about power politics.
And it could only be prevented in the future by superior French power, not by some lofty international organization. And that clash between French sécurité and American principles, that becomes the defining tension of the entire peace conference.
So let's look at Germany, because they reject the points and then suddenly they embrace them. What happened internally? What was that pivot?
That pivot was driven by, well, by sheer military failure and a deep, deep political cynicism. Initially, in early 1918, the German government was supremely confident. They believed their huge spring offensive, Operation Michael, would win the war before the U.S. could even fully mobilize, so they just rejected the points out of hand.
But the offensive failed, catastrophically.
It did. By late summer, the war was turning irrevocably against them. Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, the Duumvirate that was effectively running the country, they realized the game was up. And Ludendorff, needing someone else to take the blame for the defeat, cynically forced the Kaiser to start democratic reforms.
And then he used the 14 points.
He then used a deliberately distorted version of the 14 points to entice the new civilian government under Prince Max of Baden to seek an immediate armistice in October 1918.
So the military leadership knowingly set up the new democratic government to fail. They forced them to ask for peace based on an ideal they themselves had already violated, just to make sure that the harsh peace that followed would be blamed on the civilians.
Precisely. Ludendorff's intent was to shift all responsibility for the catastrophic military failure onto the democratic politicians. And in doing so, he created this poisonous, lasting myth that the army had not been defeated in the field. They expected a just settlement based on Wilson's terms, knowing full well the Allies would demand much, much more.
And that expectation of a just settlement was only encouraged by the ferocious, highly personal domestic opposition that Wilson was facing back in the U.S.
The domestic resistance was intense, particularly from Republicans and isolationists. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, who had already broken with Wilson, he warned that if the League of Nations was built on the high-sounding and as meaningless 14 points, it would just become one more scrap to the diplomatic wastepaper basket. He saw it as utopian nonsense.
And the opposition in the Senate, which would eventually crush the League, was even more vehement.
Absolutely. The isolationist faction, led by Senator William Borah of Idaho, they saw any foreign entanglement as a betrayal of American interests. Borah famously wished the League of Nations, which he called a treacherous and treasonable scheme, to be buried in hell, and he promised he would make sure it was 20,000 leagues under the sea.
So this entrenched resistance to the centerpiece of the whole thing was like a political time bomb. It basically guaranteed Wilson's vision would fail at home, even if he somehow managed to secure it abroad.
It was a time bomb, yeah.
It's just startling how quickly this American idealism resonated globally, far beyond the circles of diplomats and generals. Wilson became this towering, almost religious figure, an agent of salvation and justice for anti-colonial nationalist movements all over the world. This period, from 1918 to 1920, is accurately called the Wilsonian moment.
It was a massive, and I should say, completely unintended consequence of his rhetoric. Nationalist leaders and oppressed peoples in Asia, in Africa, in the Near East, they heard Wilson's emphasis on autonomy and self-determination explicitly in points X, 11, 12, and 13, and they interpreted it as this revolutionary promise of independence from European imperial rule.
They saw the United States, a country founded on a revolution against a colonial power, as inherently sympathetic to their cause.
And that created this huge worldwide optimism that the 14 points would fundamentally reshape the relationship between the West and the colonized world, that it would lead to more equitable terms.
And then this is where that gap between the rhetoric and the actual policy just becomes a gaping wound.
We have to apply a harsh reality check here. Wilson's goals were not to oppose the British or French colonial powers. His calls for sovereignty were strategically aimed solely at carving up the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, the empires he was fighting. He never ever intended to dismantle the Allied empires.
So he was offering a moral path to self-determination, but only for the territories controlled by his enemies.
Precisely. And what's more, Wilson's views on the non-European world were profoundly shaped by the prevailing racial prejudices of his time. The historical record is just crystal clear on this. Wilson was the fundamental believer in white supremacy. He did not believe that the non-European world was ready for immediate self-governance.
So how did that belief translate into specific policy for what we now call the Third World?
Wilson's goals for those regions were about influence, not freedom. He wanted to incorporate these nations into the global commercial world, a world open to U.S. goods and investment, by transforming them from what he saw as backward to sophisticated. He asserted that a period of trusteeship or tutelage from colonial powers was required for the proper development of colonized nations.
So a mandatory waiting period.
A necessary waiting period before eventual self-governance, which in his view might take decades. And he had a history of supporting this selective kind of imperialism.
Right, in the Philippines.
He did. He'd actively supported the U.S. annexation of the Philippines in 1898. He condemned the rebellion of the nationalist Emilio Aguinaldo against American rule. Wilson fundamentally believed the U.S. and European powers were morally obliged to impose Western forms of governance and ways of life. And this fundamental contradiction, preaching universal self-determination while only applying it selectively based on his own racial and political hierarchy, that was the reason the global optimism of the Wilsonian moment so quickly, and in some cases so violently, just crashed into profound disillusionment.
The ultimate collision of that idealized vision and messy political reality, of course, happened at the Paris Peace Conference, which gave us the Treaty of Versailles. And we know that throughout the interwar period, the 14 points were immediately used in Germany as a weapon to attack that treaty as illegitimate.
That's right. The widespread German grievance was that the treaty was not a negotiated agreement based on the 14 points at all, but a dictate imposed by the victors. And that fundamentally violated the promise of Point I, open diplomacy.
But historians argue that Wilson himself played a role in just discarding Point I.
They do. Historian Alan Sharp points out that Wilson essentially just ignored open diplomacy during the negotiations in Paris. The process was incredibly cumbersome. You had hundreds of delegates, complex, often conflicting demands. Open diplomacy would have paralyzed the conference completely.
So when the Allies finally managed to agree on a common set of terms, they presented them to the Germans in May 1919 and just chose not to engage in negotiation.
And the reason was simple. They were terrified that if they opened the floor to German objections, the fragile consensus among the Allies would just shatter instantly. The refusal to negotiate was driven by the Allies' desperate desire to just get the peace conference over with after months of painful wrangling.
But it confirmed the German perception of a diktat.
It did. And it created immense political ammunition for anyone seeking to undermine the Weimar Republic later on. As Sharp argues, Wilson had inadvertently set himself up for failure. He had given a series of speeches painting the post-war world in these colors of absolute moral perfection. So when the complex, messy, compromise-laden Treaty of Versailles actually emerged, profound disappointment was inevitable. No negotiated settlement could ever match that rhetoric.
Let's talk about the most infamous element used to fuel that grievance. Article 231, often called the War Guilt Clause, and the whole issue of reparations.
Article 231 stated that Germany accepted the responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. And Germans immediately saw this as assigning full, sole moral responsibility for starting the war, which they just deeply resented.
But historical sources suggest the Allied powers had a different, more practical interpretation of it.
They did. Historian Sally Marks emphasizes that the primary purpose of Article 231 was technical and financial. It was a liability clause, designed to establish a legal basis for demanding reparations. It was included in all the peace treaties with the Central Powers, and only the German diplomats chose to interpret it as this definitive moral judgment on their role in starting the war.
But that moral interpretation is the one that stuck.
It absolutely took root in the German psyche.
Yeah.
And regarding reparations, the figures themselves seemed designed to cause maximum public shock. The initial assessment was massive, 269 billion gold marks. Later, in 1921, it was set at a more realistic 192 billion.
The numbers were designed to look imposing.
Exactly. To satisfy domestic audiences in Allied countries who wanted Germany punished. But the people setting the figure, like John Maynard Keynes, they knew Germany couldn't possibly pay the full amount.
So they prioritized political optics over fiscal reality.
Absolutely. In the end, only a fraction of the total had to be paid before the whole system collapsed. But the grievance remained, fueled by that staggering headline number and the perceived moral injury of Article 231.
But historians like Gerhard Weinberg argue that even if the treaty had been substantially fairer, it probably wouldn't have mattered because of a completely domestic and frankly poisonous German myth.
That's the Dolchstoßlegende, or the stab-in-the-back myth. Weinberg argues that the entire debate over the justice of Versailles is, in many ways, irrelevant, because the German elites, and later the public, believed their country had actually won World War I and was only defeated by this alleged stab in the back.
A betrayal perpetrated by democratic, socialist, and Jewish elements during the November Revolution of 1918.
The very politicians who had been set up by the military, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, who had cynically engineered the democratic takeover, were the ones most responsible for propagating this narrative. They shielded the German army from the reality of its crushing military defeat.
And this belief had real consequences.
Oh, this pervasive belief in military invincibility led German elites, including Hitler, to flippantly and aggressively challenge the international order later on. Weinberg points to the incredible example of 1941, where Hitler felt so confident, based on this Dolchstoßlegende conviction, that Imperial Germany had crushed the U.S. in 1918, that he just declared war on the United States, expecting an easy win.
Wow.
The myth of internal betrayal, not the treaty-specific terms, became the most enduring source of post-war German discord and subsequent aggression.
Okay, so now we have to move from the ideological conflict and these foundational myths to the ground level. We have to look at specific places where the 14 points, and especially the principle of self-determination, were either upheld as a clear victory for Wilson or, more often, just brutally overridden by entrenched national interests.
We can actually start with a clean win for point 8, Alsace-Lorraine. This was the territory Germany seized in 1871. Under the armistice terms, the French immediately occupied it and proclaimed its reunion with France. And there was genuine popular support. French troops were greeted as liberators.
And the Allies stood firm on this one.
Yes. Both Wilson and Lloyd George fully supported Clemenceau's demand, and the territory was unequivocally returned to France under the Treaty of Versailles.
The Rhineland dispute, however, was anything but clean. This is where French security collided head-on with Wilsonian self-determination.
It was the defining ideological battle of the conference. Clemenceau demanded that the Rhineland be severed from Germany, either annexed or turned into a permanent military-occupied puppet state. Marshal Foch argued passionately that the Rhine River was the natural defensive barrier and that French control of it was absolutely necessary for France's survival in the face of the inevitable next German attack.
But the territory was overwhelmingly German. So annexation would have been a direct violation of self-determination, creating a new source of grievance.
Absolutely. And Wilson and Lloyd George were staunchly opposed. They feared Clemenceau's plan would create an Alsace-Lorraine in reverse, condemning future generations to another war. Wilson was so firm on this that he threatened multiple times to just pack up the American delegation and walk out of the conference entirely.
And that threat, the idea of the U.S. just abandoning the peace process, that must have been powerful enough to force a compromise?
It was decisive. Under intense Anglo-American pressure, France was forced to accept that the Rhineland would remain politically part of Germany. The compromise was that the region would be permanently demilitarized, and Allied troops would occupy it for 15 years to ensure compliance. But Clemenceau extracted a massive compensatory prize.
The Guarantee Treaty.
Yes. France was offered a compensatory military alliance with the UK and the US, guaranteeing immediate aid if Germany ever attacked again. The French saw this security guarantee as adequate compensation for giving up the territorial separation of the Rhineland.
But the U.S. Senate immediately undercut this entire agreement, turning it into a devastating political defeat for Clemenceau.
It was a catastrophic collapse. The British commitment to the alliance was explicitly conditional on the U.S. Senate ratifying the American commitment. So when the U.S. Senate, driven by those isolationists we talked about, voted against the alliance and against the Treaty of Versailles itself, the entire security arrangement just vanished.
It became null and void.
Instantly. The British immediately withdrew their conditional offer, and the French leadership felt profoundly cheated. They had given up their core security demand for an illusory alliance that Wilson, either through political naivete or arrogance about his own domestic power, failed to deliver. And this failure left the French feeling deeply insecure and willing to take matters into their own hands later on.
So if the Western Front was that complicated, what happened when these principles moved into Central Europe?
The complexity just exploded. That region was this ancient, ethnically mixed patchwork. Drawing straight, nationally defined lines was just impossible.
And we see this perfectly in the Danzig dispute regarding Point Thirth, which promised Poland free and secure access to the sea.
Danzig, or Gdańsk, was the crucial port city at the mouth of the Vistula River. The Polish delegate, Roman Dmowski, argued fiercely that if Danzig remained German, the Reich would retain economic and political control over Poland, making true independence impossible. Wilson actually supported the Polish claim at first.
But Lloyd George vehemently opposed it, right? He argued the city was 90% German and that annexing it would be a gross violation of the very self-determination Wilson was preaching.
It was an insoluble dilemma, so the impasse was resolved with a compromise. Danzig was turned into a free city. It belonged to neither nation, governed under the League of Nations, but Poland retained certain special customs and communication rights. It was a classic half measure that left both Germans and Poles completely dissatisfied.
And the loss of Danzig, the creation of the Polish corridor to connect Poland to the sea, and what happened with Upper Silesia, for Germans, this became the open wound in the East, a national humiliation that had to be reversed.
And you can see why it was so difficult to apply these principles there. The populations were so deeply intermingled. Before 1914, Germany had about 1 million Polish speakers. After 1918, Poland had about 1 million German speakers.
Right.
Any frontier you drew was going to put massive populations on the wrong side.
Upper Silesia was a particularly rich industrial region. How did the Allies try to solve that border with self-determination?
Well, they tried a referendum in 1921. But the results were just as complex as the population. 68% voted to stay in Germany, 32% for Poland. But the voting patterns reflected the ethnic mix. The urban, industrial areas went overwhelmingly for Germany, while the rural, peasant areas went for Poland.
So drawing an equitable line was impossible.
Impossible. It resulted in 3 separate armed uprisings, fierce fighting between German and Polish paramilitary groups. In the end, the Allies just had to impose an unsatisfactory frontier that left both nations feeling cheated.
And the long-term consequence of this festering Eastern wound was revealed pretty clearly years later in the Locarno Treaties of 1925.
Locarno was this brief moment of hope for European peace. Germany formally accepted its western borders. It renounced any claim to Alsace-Lorraine, accepted the demilitarized Rhineland. But this acceptance was highly conditional. A secret memo from the German State Secretary Karl von Schubert revealed the true intention. Germany could accept the western losses, but would never accept the eastern borders.
They explicitly stated there would be no Eastern Locarno.
That's right. The document said the whole purpose of improving relations with France and Britain was to persuade them to abandon their alliance with Poland. That would allow Germany to invade Poland later without fear of a Western response. So the disputes Wilson had tried to solve in the East remained a deliberate, active platform for future German aggression.
Now, the tension between the points in traditional diplomacy was never more explosive than with Italy, an allied power that was determined to get its secret wartime spoils.
Italy was lured into the war by the secret 1915 Treaty of London, which promised it huge chunks of the Austrian Empire, Trentino, Istria, much of Dalmatia. But Wilson's Point IS called for adjusting Italian frontiers only along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. The 2 documents are mutually exclusive.
So the Italian Prime Minister Orlando and Foreign Minister Sonnino arrive in Paris demanding not just the secret treaty, but more, the Treaty of London plus Fiume.
And Wilson was put in this impossible position. He made one major concession. He supported Italy getting the strategically crucial Brenner Pass as its frontier with Austria, only later admitting he hadn't realized that the majority of the population in South Tyrol spoke German. That was a clear violation of self-determination that he later regretted.
But he drew the line at Dalmatia.
He strongly opposed the Italian demands for Istria and Dalmatia. He argued that the majority of people there were Croats who wished to join the new Yugoslavia. Wilson even published an appeal directly to the Italian people, urging them to accept his principled stance over their leaders' nationalistic demands.
Which sparked a huge nationalist backlash.
Oh, yeah. Foreign Minister Sonnino's position was unyielding. He said Italy's sacrifice, specifically 500,000 Italian war dead, entitled them to the Treaty of London, regardless of Wilson's idealism. Wilson became deeply unpopular. He was targeted in cartoons, often shown in an Austrian uniform, denying Italian claims. The American embassy in Rome even needed a special police guard because of public hostility.
And the final outcome, where Italy only got parts of what it wanted, it fueled this powerful political narrative back home.
Yes. The thesis of the Victoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory, took hold. It was a claim that Italy had been robbed of its rightful spoils by their allies, and particularly by Wilson's high-minded principles. The nascent fascist party under Mussolini seized on this narrative to attack the political class for their weakness. And this grievance became a major factor in the political destabilization that led to Mussolini's rise to power in 1922.
Moving to the Near East, which was defined by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the horror of the Armenian genocide, Wilson tried to address Point 12's call for undoubted security of life through the idea of a humanitarian mandate.
The Armenian Mandate was a last-ditch attempt to protect the shattered Armenian population. Wilson recognized that the Armenian community, whose educated, political, and military leaders had been systematically exterminated since 1915, could not possibly stand as an independent state. He believed American rule was needed for at least a decade to help survivors rebuild their communities and institutions.
But this attempt at a massive American humanitarian intervention, thousands of miles away, was ultimately crushed by American isolationism.
It failed spectacularly. The U.S. Senate, already hostile to any foreign entanglement, rejected the request for the mandate on June 1, 1920. The vote was 52 senators nay against only 23 yea. That rejection signaled the final withdrawal of the U.S. from direct responsibility for the outcome in the Near East.
And the ultimate resolution in Anatolia was a horrific final rejection of Wilson's ideal of coexisting peoples.
It was the triumph of homogenization. Allied plans to partition Anatolia and enforce minority rights failed because the Turkish people rallied under Mustafa Kemal. Later Ataturk successfully resisted foreign control by force. And following a Turkish military victory over Greece in 1922, the final stage of ethnic cleansing was achieved through the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne.
That treaty authorized the Greek-Turkish compulsory population exchange.
Yes. It mandated the forced expulsion of 1 million Orthodox Greeks from Anatolia and 500,000 Muslims, mostly Turks, from Greece. This massive traumatic upheaval, carried out amid intense suffering, marked the final and complete rejection of Wilson's vision of different national groups coexisting in Asia Minor. The new Turkish Republic, in effect, achieved peace through ethnic homogeneity, which was a brutal antithesis of Wilsonian multicultural idealism.
So if the failure in the Near East confirmed the limits of Western power, the events in Asia confirmed the unexpected, radical power of Wilson's rhetoric to inspire movements he never intended to support.
Let's look at Korea first. It had been brutally annexed by Japan in 1910. The promise of national self-determination in Point 3 fueled intense Korean hopes for independence. On March 1, 1919, Korean nationalists issued a Declaration of Independence, which triggered the March 1st movement. Over 1 million Koreans demonstrated, demanding to be recognized as an independent nation.
And the Japanese response was swift and brutal suppression.
Unarmed protesters were shot down, arrested, tortured. And crucially, Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George all refused the Korean nationalists' appeals for help. They deemed the events an internal Japanese matter.
The ultimate confirmation of the hypocrisy. Self-determination was only for the former enemy empires.
Precisely. And this profound sense of betrayal led many Korean nationalists to turn their hopes away from the liberal West and towards Soviet Russia, which gave significant momentum to the emerging Korean communist movement.
And the same dynamic played out in Egypt.
Exactly the same. Egyptian politicians, led by Saad Zaghloul, arrived in Paris determined to use the 14 points to end the British occupation that had been going on since 1882. When Zaghloul and his colleagues were arrested and deported by the British in March 1919, it sparked the revolution of 1919, massive, violent demonstrations demanding immediate independence.
A seismic moment for Egyptian nationalism, even though the British maintained ultimate control.
It was. The British eventually granted nominal independence in 1922, but they kept the military occupation and control over key areas like the Suez Canal. The nationalist sentiment just persisted, permanently fueled by the feeling of being denied the full self-determination Wilson had promised. It set the stage for decades of anti-British struggle.
And finally, we get to perhaps the most globally consequential failure of Wilsonian idealism, the Shandong question between China and Japan.
This issue had massive global repercussions. Shandong province was a former German concession which Japan had occupied early in the war. Japan had secured secret treaties with the Allies promising support for their claim, and it also forced China to sign a treaty in 1915 agreeing that Japan would take over Germany's rights. China, a technical ally, came to Paris expecting the territory to be returned under the principle of self-determination.
And the Chinese diplomat Wellington Koo became a sensation by masterfully using Wilson's own words against the Allies.
Koo's diplomatic strategy was brilliant. He argued that the Sino-Japanese Treaty of 1915 was invalid because it was signed under threat of violence. And more importantly, he used point eye-open diplomacy to argue that the secret Allied treaties supporting Japan were invalid because they contradicted the spirit of the New World Order. He stressed that the people of Shandong were overwhelmingly Han Chinese and wanted to return to China.
He cornered Wilson using Wilson's own ideals, but Wilson, the author of the 14 Points, ultimately sided with Japan. And this decision, it just defies the logic of his own program.
Wilson was caught in an impossible moral and political bind. He was facing immense pressure from Japan, which threatened to walk out of the conference and refuse to join the League of Nations if their demands weren't met. And he chose pragmatism over principle, siding with Japan on April 22, 1919.
What was his justification?
His justification was damning. He argued that the war had been fought largely for the purpose of showing that treaties cannot be violated, and he asserted that China was bound by the 1915 agreement, despite the coerced circumstances. He concluded it was better to live up to a bad treaty than tear it up.
That decision must have had earth-shattering consequences for China's view of the West.
He was seen as a profound betrayal. The award of Shandong to Japan sparked the massive May 4th movement in China, where thousands of university students protested the weakness of their government and the hypocrisy of the Western powers. China ultimately refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This betrayal turned Chinese public opinion decisively against the West. Koo himself remarked years later that the outcome gave tremendous prestige to Soviet Russia, which had renounced its special rights in China. And this anger and political disillusionment led directly to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1920.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what we're really seeing is this comprehensive picture of Wilson's 14 points. It was an idealistic blueprint, sure, but it was also a strategic masterstroke that successfully helped end the Great War by providing the ideological basis for Germany's surrender. But in its application, it laid the groundwork for future conflicts and this profound global disillusionment by consistently promising a world that the victorious powers, including the U.S. Senate, were ultimately unwilling or unable to deliver.
The 14 points became more than just a peace proposal. They became this potent symbol of Wilson's failure to match his lofty rhetoric with genuine political commitment. The post-war world didn't achieve that picture of absolute moral perfection he had painted. What emerged was a chaotic, often punitive treaty built on compromise. It reflected the deeply entrenched and contradictory interests of the U.S., Britain, France, and Italy. The world was just not ready to abandon the old system of power politics for his new order.
And what stands out here is the massive dark irony. Wilson, a man who harbored deeply segregationist and racist views and who only intended self-determination for the peoples trapped in enemy empires, unintentionally unleashed forces that would ultimately undo the Allied colonial system.
That is the essential, lasting irony of the 14 points. Despite Wilson's own selective application and his personal political failings, his words open covenants, self-determination, security of life, they served as an unexpected moral and ideological foundation. They gave powerful universal language to anti-colonial and nationalist movements in places like China, Egypt, and Korea. Movements that fundamentally challenged the global hierarchy and changed the entire trajectory of the 20th century.
So you're left to consider this provocative question. If the 14 points failed to create peace in the West and failed to prevent the rise of fascism in Italy or further aggression in Germany, was the greatest lasting legacy of the 14 points the world it failed to create, or the global movements it unintentionally helped inspire against Western imperialism?
Welcome to the debate. Today we're confronting one of the most, compelling and ultimately frustrating documents in modern diplomatic history, Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points. Delivered in January 1918, these principles became the advertised terms for peace, the ethical foundation upon which the Central Powers, Germany in particular, agreed to lay down their arms. This was really a direct effort to translate American progressive ideas, things like democracy, transparent governance, into a foreign policy framework.
And their historical significance, you just can't overstate it. They were, explicitly, a statement defining what a just and secure peace should look like. A framework that was intended to move international relations beyond the cynical, shifting foundations of a new balance of power that had so tragically led to the Great War in the first place.
That is the crucial context. So here is the central question we have to wrestle with. Was the ultimate failure of the 14 points to establish a stable and just post-war order primarily due to the intransigence and geopolitical self-interest of the European allies, that external resistance and realpolitik, or were the points themselves just fundamentally flawed, containing internal contradictions from their inception that in a way guaranteed their own downfall?
I come at it from a different angle. While we can't deny the corrosive effect of Allied resistance in Paris, I would maintain that the deepest seeds of failure were inherent in the points themselves, in their contradictions, their often paralyzing vagueness, and I think most importantly, in Wilson's selective and deeply compromised application of his own lofty ideals.
I see why you'd emphasize that internal fragility, but I'm going to argue that the failure was almost entirely external. It was rooted in the deeply entrenched traditions of European realpolitik that Wilson was, frankly, attempting to sweep away. The 14 points truly represented a progressive vision. I mean, look at the opening principle. Point I, open covenants of peace openly arrived at. Or the capstone, point 14, the formation of a League of Nations. This was a radical attempt to cure the very systematic secrecy and militarism that caused the war.
The vision was certainly radical on paper. Yes, a genuine attempt to reshape global moral politics.
But that vision was derailed almost as soon as Wilson set foot in Paris. Derailed by his self-interested Allied colleagues, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Orlando. They were just inherently skeptical of what they dismissed as Wilsonian idealism. The critical obstruction, the fundamental poison that undermined the entire process, was the existence of pre-existing secret treaties.
The ones the Bolsheviks disclosed back in 1917?
Exactly. These treaties signed between the Allies long before the U.S. even entered the war, they envisioned extensive territorial changes and spheres of influence across the collapsing Ottoman Empire and beyond. They were the very definition of Old World diplomacy, and they directly violated Point's core promise of open diplomacy. It fundamentally corrupted the negotiations before they even really began. So the resulting Treaty of Versailles, well, it wasn't a pure application of the points. It was a messy, often contradictory compromise dictated by these competing Allied interests. Britain, for instance, refused to accept Point 2, freedom of the seas, under any circumstances, and they demanded massive German reparations. The blame for the failure to secure a just peace rests squarely with those who prioritize their own nationalistic self-interest over the stated principles for a new world order.
And I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the failure rests primarily with the Allies overriding an otherwise perfect document. The weaknesses were inherent in the principles themselves, and I think Wilson's profound lack of commitment to applying them universally.
That's a harsh assessment. How do you square that with the genuine idealism he brought to Paris?
Well, we have to consider the strategic context first. Wilson introduced the 14 points not just as a moral crusade, but partially to provide an urgent ideological alternative to Lenin and his communist regime, especially after Lenin issued the Decree on Peace and started publishing those, embarrassing secret treaties. Wilson needed to seize the moral high ground globally, but this strategic idealism was compromised from the very first stroke of the pen. The core principle that generated the most global hope, national self-determination, it was never intended to be universal. Wilson's genuine intent was for it to apply solely to territories under the Central Powers. It was a specific tool designed to destabilize those enemy empires and redraw the map of Central and Eastern Europe.
But it was applied extensively in Europe, leading to the creation of new nations.
Yes, in Europe. But he explicitly viewed non-European regions as unready for self-governance. He asserted that a period of trusteeship and tutelage was necessary. And this was based on his deeply ingrained beliefs regarding the, quote, inferiority of the non-European races. The principle was fundamentally exclusionary. It created a hierarchy of humanity that just undercut its own claim to universality.
So you're suggesting the principles were fatally prejudiced from the very start?
That's precisely what I am suggesting. And this hypocrisy, it led directly to massive global disillusionment. You just have to look at the nationalist leaders in Korea. They launched the March 1st movement in 1919, appealing directly to the 10 points for independence from Japanese rule. They saw Wilson's promise as their key to freedom. Similarly, you had Egyptian politicians led by Saad Zaghloul, who tried to travel to the peace conference to end the British occupation, sparking the revolution of 1919. In both cases, Wilson refused to support them. He viewed these struggles as either internal Japanese matters or internal British colonial issues. So the global promise of self-determination was exposed as, frankly, hollow rhetoric outside of the European context, fueling global anti-colonial movements that felt deeply betrayed.
That's a powerful and a necessary critique regarding the non-European context. The selectivity is certainly undeniable. However, let's focus on the compromises Wilson did make in Europe. The core of my argument is that these compromises, while regrettable, were necessary acts of diplomatic realpolitik. They were forced upon him by the overwhelming Allied commitment to their own prior agreements.
I accept that Allied pressure was immense, but necessity is often just the excuse for betraying a principle.
Well, consider the hard choices he faced. Accepting the incorporation of the German-majority South Tyrol into Italy, or agreeing to the demilitarization of the Rhineland as a concession to French security demands. Wilson had to accept these localized betrayals of self-determination to secure the broader, future-looking framework of Point 14, the League of Nations. He believed that even a flawed league, one that could grow and correct mistakes over time, was more valuable than adhering strictly to every point in a post-war environment dominated by vengeful victors. Wasn't that the ultimate, albeit tragic, Wilsonian choice? Sacrificing the local to save the global structure?
I would push back on that interpretation, and strongly. Those compromises fundamentally demonstrated that Wilson's principles were disposable the moment they conflicted with powerful Allied opposition or conflicting U.S. strategic interests. You frame those as European compromises, but look at the Shandong question in China. That situation exemplifies the ultimate bankruptcy of Wilson's selective morality.
The Japanese were insisting on taking over the former German concessions and rights in China's Shandong province, right? Based on a 1915 treaty signed years earlier.
Correct.
And the Chinese diplomat Wellington Koo presented a masterful argument using Wilson's own ideals. He argued that the 1915 treaty was invalid because it was signed under the threat of Japanese violence. More damningly, he pointed out that the secret treaties between the Allies, Britain, France, and Italy, promising support to Japan, violated Point 1's fundamental call for open diplomacy. Here was a chance for Wilson to uphold both open diplomacy and self-determination against the weight of Allied secrecy and imperial ambition.
And he failed.
He didn't just fail, he actively sided with Japan. Wilson argued it was, quote, better to live up to a bad treaty than tear it up, effectively choosing to uphold a coercive, secret treaty rather than enforce his own principle of open covenants. That decision was catastrophic. It confirmed the global suspicion that the 14 points were merely a tool of Western power politics. And that betrayal directly sparked the massive May 4th movement in China, demonstrating just how quickly his credibility evaporated the moment his principles clashed with entrenched great power diplomacy.
That case certainly highlights a monumental failure of execution on Wilson's part. A failure to defend his own creation when faced with that kind of geopolitical pressure. But let's return to the underlying issue that plagued the entire conference, the sheer unmanageable complexity of applying self-determination. The failure wasn't just Wilson's intentions, it was the reality on the ground that the points tried, perhaps impossibly, to simplify.
I agree that complexity was a factor, but that vagueness in application meant the failure was guaranteed by the point's inherent limits. Point 12, regarding the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, proved this dramatically in Asia Minor. When the Allies tried to implement the notion of ethnic self-determination there, the concept simply, it fractured.
How so?
Well, the material shows that Muslim peoples in the region, Turks, Kurds, Arabs, define themselves far more by their allegiance to the Sultan Caliph and by religion than by the neat ethnic lines the European delegates were trying to draw. Almost all Kurds, for example, remained loyal to the Sultanate, so the simplistic framework of the 14 points rooted in 19th century European nationalism, it just couldn't handle the multi-layered identities of Asia Minor.
I accept that premise, that the complexity of applying self-determination made any peaceful solution incredibly difficult regardless of who the framer was. Puchert's analysis of boundary disputes in Central Europe perfectly illustrates this geographical reality. Just consider Upper Silesia, a deeply contested region between Germany and Poland.
A region that had been industrialized, right? Leading to a complex mix of populations?
Precisely. It was a demographic patchwork. Due to historical migration and the pull of industrial work, urban areas in the contested districts often voted overwhelmingly German, while the surrounding rural areas were often overwhelmingly Polish. This physical reality made drawing clearly recognizable lines of nationality, as the points demanded, an almost impossible task. The Allied commissioners struggled, precisely because of this reality on the ground. This isn't necessarily a flaw in the moral ideal of self-determination, but a tragic reality of Central European geography that was simply too complex for any one formula to resolve cleanly.
I grant you that the physical reality was difficult. But the rhetoric of the points created a situation where every territorial decision was judged not against difficult pragmatism, but against the standard of moral perfection. And that brings us to the point's ultimate role in creating future conflict. They inadvertently gave Germany the perfect narrative weapon to resist the peace.
You're referring to the German attack on the Treaty of Versailles as an illegitimate diktat.
Exactly. Germans attacked the treaty as having been imposed contrary to the promise of the 14 points. It made the points a symbol of Wilson's failure to match his rhetoric and contributed to a widespread, toxic sense of letdown. This sense of betrayal wasn't limited to Germany. It fueled movements like the Vittoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory thesis in Italy, arguing Italy had been humiliated and denied its rightful spoils by Wilson's interference. The point set a universal standard that, when unmet, guaranteed deep resentment among both the defeated and the perceived shortchanged victors.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it places too much emphasis on the moral failure of the points, and not enough on the deep-seated psychological need of the Germans to reject any peace. The points were merely a convenient target. They weren't the root cause of the future conflict.
Why do you say that?
Well, historians like Gerhard Weinberg argue that the vast majority of Germans in the interwar period believed wholeheartedly in the Dolchstoßlegende, the notorious stab-in-the-back myth. They genuinely believed Germany had not been defeated militarily. They believed they'd been betrayed by socialists and Jews on the home front. Now, if you believe you haven't lost the war, then the details of the treaty, whether it adhered perfectly to point I or point X, they become irrelevant. Any treaty, regardless of how closely it followed the 14 points, would have been challenged and rejected by a German public convinced they had actually won. Weinberg notes that given this widespread, entrenched belief in German victory, the question of the treaty's justice based on the 14 points became secondary to the inevitability of a future German challenge to the international order.
That is a compelling argument about the power of the Dolchstoßlegende in shaping German political reality. However, the points gave the Germans and the world the perfect yardstick to measure the treaty's failure. They didn't just reject the treaty because they felt cheated. They rejected it because it fundamentally contradicted the very terms of surrender that Wilson himself had proposed. They were arguing against the betrayal of promise, not just a military defeat. That narrative provided a global, moral legitimacy to their cause of revisionism that simple nationalism would have lacked.
The intent of the points was sound. It was to challenge the status quo of secret deals and power blocks. The tragedy is simply that the entrenched powers of the Allies had the practical means, military and economic, to override that moral challenge, regardless of how well framed it was.
And the tragedy for Wilson is that he himself provided the evidence of the points' internal frailty by failing to stand by them when it mattered most, from Shandong to South Tyrol.
So to summarize my position, the 14 points established absolutely vital precedents for international governance. They successfully challenged the traditional power politics and secret diplomacy that had caused the war, and while the resulting post-war settlement was deeply flawed and certainly created resentment, the primary failure lies not in the principles themselves, but in the overwhelming nationalist ambitions of the great powers, embodied most clearly by those pre-existing secret treaties who prioritized their own narrow self-interest over the necessary, albeit difficult, path of multilateral cooperation defined by Wilson's moral vision.
And my position remains that the failure was intrinsic, rooted in implementation. Wilson's selective application of those very principles, favoring European territorial claims like the Rhineland demilitarization, while simultaneously ignoring global anti-colonial movements in Korea and Egypt, and crucially, reneging on open diplomacy in the Shandong question, it all meant the idealistic rhetoric could not withstand contact with geopolitical reality. The result was not a secure peace, but a global template for resentment and a profound sense of betrayal, which confirmed the suspicion that self-determination was merely a political tool aimed only at defeated empires.
I think we can certainly agree that the material confirms that the 14 points were simultaneously a landmark blueprint for global peace and a powerful testament to the challenges faced when you attempt to impose universal moral principles upon entrenched national self-interest and just complex ethnic and geopolitical realities.
Indeed. The story of the 14 points shows us that the mechanics of power settlements are often too gritty and perhaps too human for pure idealism to survive intact. There is clearly much more to explore in how such high ideals collide with the difficult, messy reality of rebuilding a post-war world.